everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about the golden age of English literature.
Thus, we welcome thee in the period of the England Queen Victorian's reign, or also widely known as the Victorian era, existed approximately around 1837 until the Queen's death in 1901. First, let's see how society worked in this era. The social condition. During the Victorian era, the social classes were classified into four groups. The upper class included people such as the royals and lords, officers as well as businessmen, and any other wealthy man. The middle class served as the majority during this era and consists of people like the bourgeois as well as standard people who can work for a proper living. Due to the rapid growth and advancement of the economy, the middle class swiftly expanded. Merchants, shopkeepers, and white-collar professions were popular during this time. Next, there was the working class. This class comprised unskilled laborers who worked in industries with low wages and brutal circumstances, while the lower class refers to the helpless one, where they can only live by relying on others. This class includes poor people and also orphans. However, compulsory education was established around the year 1870, after it previously belonged to the upper class only. Before the establishment, those belonging to rich families could get the best tutors to teach them, while the other classes barely had access to the luxury of education at all. This act also aims to reduce the number of students who stop going to school due to economic reasons and to equalize the education differences between the rural and urban areas. So what made the Victorian era expand so swiftly? What differs it from the previous periods? The answer is railway. In 1825, Britain managed to launch the world's first railway powered by steam locomotive traction, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, manufactured by George Stephenson. The new invention firstly caused a fuss among the local people, but it was later proven that locomotive workings were worth the investment as it significantly reduced the cost of transport and increased the economic flow of the people. The political condition. And now we are moving to politics, because what is society without some political mayhem, right? During the Victorian era, England's political system was a constitutional monarchy. England was known to be one of the powerful nations in terms of politics. This is because at the time it had a stable government, a developing franchise as well as an expanding state. The government in this era consists of the monarchs and the two houses of parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. During Queen Victoria's reign, the House of Commons, which had 600 members of parliament, became the center of government. The other house, the House of Lords, was populated by several hundred noblemen. Both of the houses were from the upper class. As the trials and tribulations of the radical social and economic changes, there were a lot of political events related to labor activism provoked during the era. For example, there was counter-revolution, a term to describe an act of opposing or refusing a certain revolution to overturn and reverse the change, while counter-revolution in arts and literature seems to refer to the rejection of alteration in some aspects of arts and literature. The cultural condition. The significant aspect that plays a major role in cultural condition of the Victorian era is art and architecture. Most of the arts are in a form of literary works, where reading is also considered to be a culture. The Victorian works of literature were also indeed various and rich. The architecture. In terms of architecture, the Gothic Revival style was the most popular at the time. It was developed as a reaction to the symmetry of Palladianism. The architecture of this era has three main features. The first one is the ornamentation. It means that the buildings were decorated with extravagant ornaments. The second one is colorful exteriors, where homes and buildings are mostly painted in a very colors, jewel tones as well as earth color. And the last one is complicated structures. It refers to the complex building designs such as bay windows, chimney pits, rooflines or mansard roof, and also large wraparound ports. Fashion. The fashion of the Victorian era is fascinating as well. Women commonly dressed in a rather tightly laced corset over bodice or chemise, and paired them with a skirt adorned with numerous embroideries and trims over layers of petticoats. It may sound quite uncomfortable, but it actually reflects the usual wealth. The bigger the outfit is, the richer the lady is. As for men, they were identical to wear a calf-length frock coat or vest. The vests were single or double-breasted, with notched collars and finished in double point at the lowered waist. Cravats and hats were also iconic during this era. Foods. At first, the choice of foods during the Victorian era was limited to the season. But since the existence of the railways, various kinds of food began to come across the country and increased choice of foods. Some of the popular foods and drinks at the time were mutton, bacon, pork, dairy products, vegetables in season, treacle, milk, and tea. Victorian values. Victorian values were influenced from Queen Victoria during the Victorian era in this British Empire. The Christian Church moral, hard work, and personal success were much prioritized. Victorian values also include duty, seriousness, modesty, and proper behavior. However, there are notable differences between the lifestyles of various people since the feudalism during this era was still at its peak. For example, the wealthy and the poor had incredibly different lives. People are grouped into classes. Opportunities and expectations for men and women also varied. Philosophers in the Victorian era. There were many thinkers and reformers in England who made remarkable works and had such influence during the era. Some of them are T.H. Green, John Stuart Mill, and Herbert Spencer. Thomas Hill Green. Born on April 7, 1836, Thomas was an English educator, political theorist, and idealist philosopher of the so-called Neo-Kantian school. Green's key ideas were consciousness and free will. Man, he said, is self-conscious. Green based his ethics on the spiritual nature of man. He maintained that man's determination to act upon his reflection is an act of will, and is not externally determined by God or any other factor. His famous works are the Prolegomena to Ethics and lectures on the principle of political obligation. John Stuart Mill. Born on May 7, 1806. Mill was an English philosopher, economist, and exponent of utilitarianism. He was one of the most influential thinkers in the history of classical liberalism. He contributed widely to social theory, and political economy. Mill's main key idea is utilitarianism, which promotes the hyperrealism for the sake of happiness. No imaginations or emotions are allowed. Mill has many famous works, namely The Principle of Political Economy, Autobiography, Examination of Sir William Hamilton's Philosophy, On Liberty, A System of Logic, The Subjection of Women, and Utilitarianism. Herbert Spencer. Born on April 27, 1820. Spencer was an English philosopher, biologist, anthropologist, and sociologist. He was famous for his hypothesis for social Darwinism, whereby a superior physical force shapes history. His main key ideas were evolution, natural philosophy, survival of the fittest, cultural evolution, social Darwinism. Spencer developed an all-embracing conception of evolution as the progressive development of the physical world, biological organisms, the human mind, and the human culture and societies. Some of Spencer's influential works are the descriptive sociology, first principles, social statics, the man versus the state, the proper sphere of government, and the synthetic philosophy. Religion in the Victorian era. Most Victorian Britons were Christian. The Anglican churches of England, Wales, and Ireland were the state church of which the monarch was the nominal head and dominated the religious landscape. The Victorian period is also often noted for being an age of great faith and at the same time an age of great doubt due to science and religion both underwent dramatic changes. For example, here are two literary works that shows its different views in the Victorian era. William Paley's Natural Theology, 1802. It repeated the argument owing the existence of a designing God. Paley's work was enormously influential for its emphasis on nature as God's creation. By the 1830s, few Christians saw a need to prove God's existence, preferring to take this as an act of faith. Darwin's Origin of the Species, 1859. It seems to suggest a restricted or even non-existent role of God in the universe, especially with his famous evolution theory. As a result, the Anglican politico-religious establishment has been weakened. While some emphasized its radicalism, others were able to implement it into their religious worldview with ease. The Oxford Movement. Even though there are doubts on religious beliefs, the Victorian era is far from irreligious. The Victorian period is known for being an age of great faith. One of the many proofs is the Oxford Movement in the era. What is it? According to Encyclopedia, the Oxford Movement was an effort by Anglican clergymen of Oxford University between 1833 and 1845 to renew the Church of England by revival of Catholic doctrine and practice. Oxford Movement thought and practiced within the Church of England in opposition to the Protestant tendencies of the Church. The argument was that the Anglican Church was by history and identity a truly Catholic Church. Who were the central figures? The first one is leaders of the movement were John Henry Newman, a clergyman and subsequently a convert to Roman Catholicism and a cardinal. Next, John Cable, a clergyman and poet. And then last is Edward Pusey, a clergyman and professor at Oxford. What was the impact of the movement on society? The Oxford Movement may have failed to revive Catholic orthodoxy or to check the rising liberalism in the Church of England. However, its successful revival of Anglo-Catholic sacramental and liturgical practice has greatly influenced the spirit and form of contemporary Anglican worship. It brought the insights of the liturgical movement into the life of the Church. It also increased the establishment of Anglican monastic communities for men and for women, and better educated clergy who were more concerned with pastoral care of their church members.
Feminism in the Victorian era. The Victorian woman's role was at home, as domesticity and motherhood were considered by society to be sufficient for the emotional fulfillment of females. They ran the household, bore the children, and were nurses, mothers, wives, and teachers, but they had no standing in society. Writer Virginia Woolf, in her book A Room of One's Own, described how men socially and physically dominate women. She argued that women are simultaneously victims of themselves as well as victims of men and are upholders of society by acting as mirrors to men. There are also activists such as Emmeline Pankhurst who attempted to show that British women needed more than domestic servility. These women were frustrated by their social and economic situation and sought an outlet through which to initiate change. The first wave originated in the Langham Place Circle in the 1850s, led by Barbara Boddicon and Bessie Rayner Parkes. They campaigned for improved female rights in the law, employment, education, and marriage. The work of such advocates for women's rights as John Stuart Mill were enough to spearhead a movement that would encompass mass groups of women fighting for suffrage. Mill had first brought the idea of women's suffrage up in the platform he presented to British electors in 1865, which brought numerous men and women fighting for the same cause. Sexuality in the Victorian era. The Victorian period is a key moment in the history of sexuality. It is the era in which the modern terminologies we use to structure the ways we think and talk about sexuality were invented. From the 1880s, sexologists such as Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis created terms including homosexuality, heterosexuality, and nymphomaniac. Significantly, this began a new opposition of homo and heterosexuality, categories which did not simply denote sexual behavior but were perceived as central to each individual's identity. However, there are limits to accommodation of queer desire in this period, shown most famously in the trials and imprisonment of Oscar Wilde. It is important, though, to recognize the surprising tolerance of this period. Fictions by authors such as Sarah Waters, and Wesley's Days, and adaptations like Andrew Davies' BBC serials Bleak House and Little Dorrit are helping to shift popular perceptions of erotic experience in the 19th century. Literature in the Victorian era. Preceded by the whimsical era of Romanticism, Victorian literature kicked off in the 1830s during the reign of Queen Victoria and was enthroned as the golden age of English literature, for it produced many names we are familiar with on today's list of classics. For example, the poets Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, A. Houseman, and Christina Rossetti. However, the most significant outcome of this era was in the field of prose, such as novels. This era brought us Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Oscar Wilde, Emily Bronte, and many other authors whose works we constantly study and analyze over today. Literary trends in the Victorian era. People often think that both Romantic and Victorian eras are similar from one to another, that they get mixed up at times. However, compared to the Romantic era that heavily relied on idealism, imagination, and emotion, the Victorian era turned out as a mature sister who was more realistic as she had learned and experienced social, technological, and scientific advance in her time. The writing in the Victorian era often reflected on the real issues, such as the social and economic hierarchy and the feud between religion and science. The significant realism drawn during this era resulted in the rise of Gothic fiction. Gothic fiction is defined to prevail horror, gloomy, and mysterious atmospheres around it. It meddles with the uncanny themes of strange places, castles and manors in Wuthering Heights and Dracula, psychological darkness, the strange case of Jekyll and Hyde, the picture of Dorian Gray. Disturbing relationships, Matilda, Jane Eyre, Rebecca, or even supernatural, such as the Turn of the Screw. Prose in the Victorian era. As we mentioned before, the Victorian era was a golden age, especially for prose. In the era of radical breakthroughs in economy, science, and religion, the scientific discoveries provoked doubt and thoughts of people's faith. Aside from novels and short stories, the essay genre of prose was also huge in this era. For instance, there were Thomas Carlyle, John Henry Newman, John Ruskin, Lord Babington Macaulay, and others. These prose writers were primarily interested in employing literature as media to communicate issues with the countrymen as an instrument for social reforms and propaganda. Poetry in the Victorian era. Since there was a lot of radical social change, poetry in this era was way less romanticized compared to the Romantic period. In general, it was divided into two main groups, which are the High Victorian poetry and the Pre-Raphaelite poetry. The High Victorian poetry. The most significant characteristic during this period is the use of sensory elements to convey the themes. As a consequence of the radical social shift, Victorian poetry usually comprised realistic themes such as politics, morality, religion, struggles in myth and beliefs, and many more. An example of a Victorian poet is Lord Alfred Tennyson. His work ranged from the topics of romance, nature, and politic critics. In charge of the Light Brigade, Tennyson censors the military system during the era. The Pre-Raphaelite poetry. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, later known as the Pre-Raphaelites, was a group of English painters, poets, and art critics founded in 1848. Drawing inspiration from visual art and literature, their work privileged atmospheres and mood over narrative, focusing on medieval subjects, artistic introspection, female beauty, sexual yearning, and altered states of consciousness. The first characteristic is that it was a revolt and response against the traditional form of poetry that concentrated on politics, religion, and society. Instead, the Pre-Raphaelites form chose to glorify the artistic values and treat poetry similarly to paintings. The second characteristic is that putting aesthetic and artistic values above all. For that reason, the poetry in this movement had no morality to preach and no reforms to introduce to correctness of societal life. The third characteristic is the significant motif of medievalism, chivalry, and knighthood as escapes. Gigi Rossetti's The Blessed Damozel and Sister Helen are medieval in outlook and form. The fourth characteristic of pre-Raphaelite poetry is that this poetry reviving the biblical theme, as seen in Kristen Rossetti's Eve, 1864, that uses the set of Eden and Adam and Eve as a symbolism. Drama in the Victorian era. During the reign of Queen Victoria, theaters flourished. The radical political reforms had opened access for anyone. To let more people enjoy, the transportation of the crew was heavily improved. The streets became safer at night, allowing people to go out and play to run longer. One of the popular drama forms in this period was pictorial drama, which placed great emphasis on the use of properties and carefully studied costume detail and reflected a fashionable interest in the archaeology and history. A prominent playwright during the Victorian period was Oscar Wilde. In the field of prose, Wilde might be known for his Gothic novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and his short stories, but comedy was his drama forte instead. His depictions of the dysfunction and shallow nature of people in the Victorian era gave the importance of being earnest a clever and captivating comedic edge as the story wrapped around misfortunes of the cast. His other famous plays are namely Lady Windermere's Fan, An Ideal Husband, A Woman of No Importance, and many more. Not only did he satirize the characteristics of Victorian people, Wilde also subtly condemned a lot of social aspects, particularly women and marriage. Industrial revolutions and Dickens. During the Victorian era, as the industrial field grew, it was no secret that the workers were often exploited. In hard times, the working class is called the hands, denoting that the workers are merely hands to the people in the upper part of the body. Moreover, the working class here is represented by Stephen Blackpool. He has to face unfair treatment from the owner of the factory. He has been accused as a bank robber without any strong evidence. Furthermore, in his effort to clear his name, he dies. Blackpool's death symbolizes the hard yet powerless life in the working class has to face. Women authors in the Victorian era. The issue of women as writers had gradually risen since the Restoration era in the 16th. With Opera Band as the pioneer, women started to write professionally. However, women authors still had to write under pseudonyms, unless they wanted to receive vitriol that would focus on their femininity and gender roles. In the Victorian era, for instance, there was Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the pen name George Eliot. She was an English novelist, poet, and journalist. Aspiring to break the stereotype of women writers with light-hearted romance, her writing was widely known for its realism, a sense of space, psychological insight, and detailed depiction of the countryside. The most popular work of her is Middlemarch. Another icon of women authors in the Victorian era is Jane Austen. Her works might have primarily focused on romance, but she also incorporated deeper aspects of marital and women. During that era, women were often dependent on their husbands for social status and financial security. Her writing is vastly acclaimed for its comedy and realistic characterizations. Some of her famous works are namely Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Emma. And that is a wrap for the long historical Victorian era of English literature. Thank you guys for watching, and we hope you enjoy our video. Goodbye!